streaming. Are we here? Do we exist? Is there enough internet for everyone in the house?
I'm sure it's fine. I haven't been back today.
Sorry, Angie. Oh, okay. We've just been hanging out. with
Watching me text.
With nobody knowing what. Okay, sorry. Anyway. Okay, hi, Angie.
Hey guys.
All right, so this is John. We're the Nelsons.
Yep.
We work for Crew in Manhattan, and we are joined by Angie, who is acting as our resident Enneagram expert, although she probably would balk at the idea of being the expert.
Yes.
So we're excited to have her, though, because she's really good at explaining things, so you might think she's an expert. And also, in fact, I think that as you get to know the Enneagram through this, you might even see how Angie's number might prevent her from claiming expert just yet. It kind of goes with our personalities a little bit. I feel like we could probably just get started explaining maybe what the Enneagram is for those of you who've never heard of, have missed sort of the explosion of popularity that happened in the last year or two.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain, Angie, a bit of how you would describe an overview of the concept of the Enneagram, since it's so different from a lot of personality tests?
Sure. Yeah. I love assessments. So I came across the Enneagram actually last year, and have taken a little bit of a deeper dive into it. And so when you hear the Enneagram, sometimes you might think, okay, what does that even mean? So Ennea actually in Greek means 9, and gram means diagram. So if you were to see a picture of the diagram, there's basically 9 personality types, where the general idea is that one is one of these types, and it really describes. I've heard it be described as almost like an internal GPS. That it tells you why you think, feel, and behave the way that you do, and it really reveals your motivations behind your action. A lot of personality assessments will tell you. This is how you act in this situation. They will describe a little bit more about your behaviors. But the thing that's unique about the Enneagram is that it really shares the motivations and the why behind what you do. And then I've also heard for each of the 9 types. Basically, if you've ever put on a pair of sunglasses with a different color lens, like maybe an orange lens, whenever you orange lens is on, everything that you see is going to be tinted orange because that's the lens from which you see the world. And so basically, I've heard the Enneagram be described as more like 9 different lenses that we're all viewing our world through our color lens of the Enneagram and what our numbers are. And so it's a really helpful way, I think, just to even know how you see and interact with the world and how others do as well. So.
That was so good.
Yeah. Super concise.
It's true of our experience, too.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. What's your favorite number?
You can't ask that.
I know. No,
what's my favorite? Well, you're not supposed to have a number. I do have a number that I think I would want.
Oh, okay.
I won't say. I'm not that.
We all do. It sounds like there is
just keep going.
An echo on the stream, so we're gonna do some tech stuff, but yeah, I think everyone kind of has a number in mind. I think it's different depending on your personality, what you wish you were, and kind of what you are super glad you're not, because that sounds real because of your perspective. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through each number. The numbers are connected in different ways, and describe how they view that, what that lens is. And as we continue, I think it'll be really tempting for people who are watching to think to themselves, okay, what am I? And I'm going to say maybe as a caveat, it's going to be really, really hard to say for sure, just in this brief overview. It takes a little bit of learning and reading to kind of dig into even your own self a bit and figure that out. Maybe even asking people who are super close to you to help you. But ultimately, it's got to be from you. And Angie will help us a little bit too with the typing thing. But just so people know, you're not going to be able to like walk away in a heartbeat and say, that's my number. But it's so worth finding out. And so how would you describe, we're going to go through each number of the Enneagram in its most simple way. So maybe we can talk about the groupings. I know they're separated into 3 groups first, and then maybe go through the groups. What do you think, Angie?
Sure. Do you mean like the triads? Like do you want to do like 8, 9s, and 1s first, or?
Yeah, we could start with 8, 9s, and 1s.
Or do you want me to describe the triads? or do you just want me to go through, or just start with like 1s and 2, 3?
Why don't we talk about what the triads are?
Depends on.
And then, let's start with 8, 9s, and 1s, and we'll just go like that.
Okay.
Even though it doesn't make sense, and for some people, after we go through, I think it'll make sense why we did that.
Sure. So if you were to see a picture of the diagram, there are triads, and there are 9 numbers. So there are 3 numbers in each of the triads. And so we have, in the information that I'm using, like people may name the triads slightly different, so it might have different names depending on what to read. But the 8, 9s, and 1s are part of the instinctual center, or like the gut triad. And so they'll have certain characteristics with that. And then you have 2, 3s, and 4s. That is the heart center, or the feeling triad. You have 5, 6, and 7s, who are more the head center, or more of the thinking triad. And I will say, just as a caveat, as you're kind of learning more about the Enneagram and the different types, it might be helpful. You might be able to narrow it down to a triad. You might think, okay, I tend to respond to this way more by my gut, or I tend to respond more by feeling or by thinking. And so that might even be a helpful way to begin to at least on what you think your type might be. So that being said, I can go through 9s and 1s, which are part of the instinctual center, or the gut triad.
Awesome.
8.
Yeah.
Sure. I'll start with 8. Again, some people title these different titles, but the 8s have been titled the protective challenger. So this is someone who typically will be very self-confident. They'll be decisive in making their decisions. They'll be willful and perhaps confrontational. And so they, sometimes people might be afraid of 8s, but I've heard the analogy where perhaps 8s are described as the snowplow, that they're not, where they are literally clearing up for other people. So they don't want to run over people, but they want to push things forward and clear a path for other people, and they're going to go after it. They're going to be decisive, and they're often your take charge type leaders. And then with all of our types, we'll have really fear and a core desire, where there's just, I know for me, when I figured out my type, the thing that really triggered for me is like, okay, deep down in my soul, what are things I'm really afraid of, and what do I really desire and want to be true in my life? And so for 8s, their core fear might be fear of being weak, of being powerless, underestimated, humiliated, vulnerable, harmed, controlled, manipulated, or at the mercy of injustice. And then their core desire is just to protect themselves. They're going to protect themselves from all of that. Yes. So
as you reminds me, I have some really good friends who are 8s, and even those who I think don't know about the Enneagram, before in the last couple of years, I can think back to before they started to learn about it, they would say things like that. We're always pushing against and hating to feel like they were trapped or controlled, whether it was people, family, or some sort of system. And so that was to kind of realize, like, okay, this makes sense. Which I think we'll all feel as we find our numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so
and like, go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Like, one thing I want to say, like, even about the Enneagram is that it's so complex. And so that even when you hear a description, like, there are even 3 different levels that we can be living out of our numbers. So we can be unhealthy, we can be average, kind of just how we are on autopilot, and we can be living in a healthy way. And so that can be different. As well as, I don't think we're going to get into wings, but the numbers on either side of you, that can greatly affect how your behaviors and that sort of thing. There's a lot in there. So just as a caveat, that if you read this and think, well, that doesn't describe me fully, but there's also varying levels of, I know for me, when I'm a 1 and my number looks different when I'm healthy and then when I'm not.
Like, you're not going to look like the other person next to you with the same number necessarily. In fact, it would be really shocking if you did.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the reasons that we like the Enneagram. It's so complex that it gets a little closer to actually touching on the complexity of people, because I think a lot of personality tests are so simplified that it really misses a lot of the nuances and intricacies that are in people, whether it's health, just ways you were raised and how you grew up and culture. And there's just so much that goes into who someone is. So next in that triad, number 9, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
9. Yep. Go to the 9. So these are the peaceful mediators. These people are described as receptive, reassuring, agreeable, complacent. Are typically going to be the non-confrontational types. And I've often heard that 9s are probably the most difficult one to type because they can hold to other types. And so to truly be a 9, it actually might, like, if you are 1, it could take a while, just of it. Their core fear is fear of being in conflict, of separate, being uncomfortable, unimportant, overlooked, alone, or in inharmonious relationship. And their core desire is to have inner stability and peace of mind. And so these people are actually really going to bring a lot of peace and comfort and unity to a situation. But yeah, they also may run from conflict as well. So yeah, I give them brief.
Yeah.
It's hard to stay brief with these because, like you said, it's so deep.
It is hard to stay brief, and so I'll do my best.
Great.
And some of them, honestly, I know more about.
That's fair.
So should I move on to 1?
Yeah, you should totally move on to the best number that there is.
So 1. I know, right? Number 1.
Sorry, we do.
Right? Okay, so number 1s are described as the moral perfectionist. So they are typically principled, purposeful, self-controlled, perfectionistic. Their core fear of being bad, evil, angry, wrong, inappropriate, corrupt, irresponsible, condemned, or unredeemable. And desire is to have integrity, balance, to be virtuous, to be ethical, and to be the good or the good boy or the good girl. And so 1s can really bring a lot of stability and having things done right and correctly, and encourage just things to be done really well in their environment. And but can also be critical. And the one thing to know about the ones is that they live with a probably almost constant inner critic, that there's something like in their mind they're likely could tell you something that is not right in a scenario. And when used in a good and healthy way, it can be used to really make things better. But an unhealth can come across as being very critical, which the actual desire is just to, and to really help others. And I have learned this the hard way, in that my desire to help often comes off critical. And we just bought a house, and it's a 120-year-old house, and I have learned that for my oneness, everywhere something wrong with this house and I just want to make it better. And it can be, it's a challenge for me sometimes to let things just and just sit and be okay with the fact that things aren't right, and it will be okay. So yeah, I think there's a lot I could say about it, John. I know you probably have some thoughts as well.
Oh yeah.
As a woman.
I think speaking to the inner critic, I know that I've, in my conversations with other people about the Enneagram, I've helped a number of people realize that they were perhaps not an 8 or perhaps not a 3, but instead actually a 1 because of that feature, that characteristic feature of the inner critic. Because, yeah, I mean, typically a 1 can walk into a room and can spot things that are misaligned or not correct, or maybe like there's an inconsistency somewhere depending on what the context is. And in a similar way, like typically a number like a Enneagram 3 can walk into a room, and we'll get to this later, and spot the most the person with the most power in the room, and they can identify the most influential person.
Yeah.
I can't identify the most influential person, but I can tell you that the sound is off when I walk into a room and music playing and the sound levels are just bad, or there's a bunch of other things. So yeah, that's and I think that is one of the biggest challenges is one, being okay with it, and knowing that two, I don't always need to step in and fix it.
Yeah. I think for me, being married to a 1,
Yeah.
I really love it because I always call John my like canary. The history of using canaries in like I guess tunnels and mines, yeah, to tell if there's this gas because it's gonna die first, and they all go like whoop and get out of there. So John dies first because John sees the problems coming from a mile away, way before the world is falling around me. Before sometimes I will realize this is, but now that I have John, he calls it right before things even really get going, and so we're able to like head things off fast and able to um, really deal with whether it's issues in job or life so much faster because he before most people do. I love that. So
I'm glad.
I've heard it said that a 1 is either, if you're a 1, it's either the best number to be or the worst number to be, depending on your health. I don't know if that's true, but I can understand why someone would say that.
Yeah. Well, and often, I have heard said about the Enneagram that even like someone who is older, like I'm in my 40s now, that to correctly see as ways to correct yourself or to correctly type yourself would to think about how you were in your early 20s, like before you 20 years of growth. Because I look back at my oneness back in my early 20s and I was like before God did this. Well, he was always working in my life, but like I have 20 years on it now, and to where I was like, okay, like that, like the inner critic was way stronger in my early 20s than it is now in my 40s, or I've learned to, I mean, it's still there, and I don't think it'll ever go away, but so being in your early 20s can be a really good time, I think, to be going through this and typing yourself.
Great. All right, so let's move on to the next triad. Now that was the feelings one, right?
No, that was the gut one.
We were just in the gut one.
Right. Yeah. We're moving into the okay.
The gut is the 8, 9.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the feeling one would be the
Sweet.
3s and 4s. Yeah, so those would be the supportive advisor. They are often described as generous, people-pleasing, and possessive. I mean, people who are often described as either the servants or the host or the hostess. They're always looking out for the needs of someone else. And in an unhealthy way over the needs of their own. They're always looking to serve others. And so their core fear would be the fear of being unloved or unwanted for purely being themselves. And their fear would be to feel loved and being wanted for themselves only. And so I know there's a friend of mine that we've been friends since 5th grade, and we both this past year have taken the deep dive into the Enneagram. She was my college roommate for 4 years. I'm a 1, she's a 2, and she has always been way more like serving. She takes the initiative. She cares for me, and I've happily received that. But as we are talking about this, I'm realizing just how important it is for me to reciprocate to her, because without this conversation, she probably never would have shown me that those were her core desires, that she wants to be loved for who she is and does for other people, but most of what she does is serving other people. So it's been good for our friendship and for me to realize that.
Awesome. And that's a good point. The Enneagram isn't just helpful for yourself, but is so helpful for loving the people around you, whether it's your family or your best friends. And it's a fun thing to kind of learn about together with your friends, because it just can only help. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, so 3 family.
3s, the successful achiever. So these are going to be your adaptable, excelling, driven, image-conscious people. Their fear is being worthless, a failure, incapable, unimpressive, unsuccessful, inefficient, and exposed. Their core desire to feel valuable and worthwhile by just being themselves without having to perform. So. Yes. Kelsey, you said you're 3?
I have right? 2 family members. My dad and my sister are both 3s. And so after learning about the Enneagram, looking back on my childhood even, it's been really interesting seeing everything from my sister having to have name brand clothes, way more than my brother and I did, by the time she was in middle school. Like, that was a big deal, how she was perceived. And then my dad, the way he talks about work, you can so see a lot of these traits coming in. But it's funny to live with a really young 3 and a much older 3 and kind of see the difference that, like you were saying, life and experience and maturity gives as you kind of grow into and out of some of those traits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Last
All right, 4s.
I was just
last one in the triad.
Yeah, last one in the triad's 4.
Oh, yes. Yes, they are the romantic individualist. So they are expressive, dramatic, self-absorbed, and temperamental. So their core fear is the fear of being inadequate, emotionally cut off, plain, ordinary, commonplace, mundane, abandoned, or flawed. And their core desire is to find themselves in their unique significance. So really at their best, really authentic, compassionate, introspective, expressive people. They're going to be creative. They're going to be withdrawn, exaggerated, depressed, self-pitying, moralistic, that sort of thing. And if we had time, we would talk about where you go in stress. So I'm familiar with this one a little bit or in unhealth, because I will go there. I will go to being a 4. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I've seen John do the same thing.
What?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And So 5's coming up.
All
That's,
right.
it's full disclosure, the I wish I was number.
Oh, really?
If I could pick a number that's not my own, I think I would pick a 5. I just love so many things about it. Yeah.
Really?
So, fun fact.
Very cool. So,
that's awesome.
Let's see. They are the investigator. So they are perceptive, innovative, secretive, isolated. At their best, they're going to be persevering, sensitive, wise, objective, curious. And then at their worst, they're going to be intellect, stingy, stubborn, distant, perhaps critical of others, or unassertive. And their core fear would be fear of obligation, annihilation, emptiness, being incompetent or ignorant, overwhelmed, dependent or invaded. And their core desire is to be capable and competent. So I was listening to a podcast today, and they talked about 5s as actually being like in their health, like the change agents of the world. Like they're going to be the ones who are very wise. They're the learners, but they're also can also be withdrawn. In this podcast they were talking about 5s as well. They may only start their day at 20% charged, and so they live the rest of their day trying to conserve in a fear of losing that charge. And so even, like being married to a 5, like I've had to learn, like there are times when I can talk about things and maybe when I need to let it go and bring it up another time. Or just my husband's from Vermont and grew up backpacking in the White Mountains in the cold snow, and I realized how important it is for me to say, yes, honey, you may go for 5 days out in the mountains by yourself and hike. That sounds like death to me. Like I have no desire to do that whatsoever. But like his battery is getting really recharged so that he's able to come back way more able to engage in the world around him if he has those opportunities.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
I think that's so neat.
So 6, these are the loyal guardian. I've actually heard that 6 might be the most 6s in the world.
Really? I've also wondered about that. Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're described as a loyal guardian. So they would be engaging, responsible, anxious, or suspicious. At their best, these are your loyal people. They're super loyal, likable, prepared, trustworthy, compassionate, witty, practical, responsible. At their worst, they're vigilant, dependent, unpredictable, judgmental, paranoid, defensive, self-defeating, or self-doubting. I've heard 6s being described as they might walk into a room and immediately think worst case scenario, like all the stuff that could happen bad to them or to people that they love. But and I've heard that as being like one of the main identifying factors of, hey, I might be a 6 because I can think about, if we're on a bridge, how our car might go off the bridge. Yeah. Just random things, and not even to be fatalistic. It's just, honestly, I think it's because they are so loyal to their family members and friends. They're probably the people you want in a crisis because they through all the scenarios and ways to, and will be able to help you walk through that should it ever happen.
Wow. That's awesome. They kind of sound like Jason Bourne a little bit.
Yeah, right.
That sounds kind of like a superpower to me. Maybe a stressful one.
Yeah, what Jason Bourne would be typed as. I know there's different things out there where people make jokes
Probably
about.
6. I would think a 6.
Presidents or different
He
people.
certainly embodies that part of the 6.
Yeah, right. So a 6's core fear would be fear of fear itself, danger, uncertainty, chaos, not having support, security, or guidance. They have a fear of being blamed, alone, helpless, or unsafe. or physically abandoned. And then their core desire would be to have security, support, and guidance. So I guess the last one here would be the 7s. This is the one I but Alex, anyways.
This is my number.
What? Yeah. Oh, see, there you go. There's a reason why I like you. So the entertaining optimist. So spontaneous, versatile, acquisitive. At their best, they're fun-loving, spontaneous, imaginative, productive, enthusiastic, quick, confident, charming. Worst, self-focused, impulsive, escapist, rebellious, distracted, superficial, or self-destructive. Their core fear would be fear of being incomplete, inferior, limited, bored, trapped in emotional pain, sadness, disappointment, or of criticism or missing out on something. And then their core desire would be to be fully satisfied and content.
Yeah. Relatable?
No, Kelsey, yeah, it's totally relatable. Some things as I started learning about 7s. I felt like at first I felt like 7s were so stereotyped. It seemed like everyone's like, oh, bring a 7, you'll have fun. And they didn't necessarily talk about some of those harder things that you mentioned. And I think for me, it talks about, you mentioned self-destructive. I've heard that 7s are the most prone to addiction out of all the numbers. I would say for me, I knew from a pretty young age that I had a very addictive personality, that I'd sort of latch onto things and try and use that to distract me from pain maybe I was experiencing or from dealing with reality, period, things like that. And so I'm always having to be on the lookout, like, am I latching on to something to distract myself from what I really need to be feeling, especially with 7s being in that thinking group. It is more easy to think through your feelings than to actually feel the grief. Say, I intellectually, this is sad, as opposed to I feel broken. And so one of the things too that popped in my mind is, to this day, I just have to own it. I wish that I was like a 4 who was so deep and who's able to engage with like sad stories and just like really enjoy them because of how thoughtful they are. There's so many classic movies that I would love to watch just because they're classics and I feel like I ought to. But I cannot bring myself to experience the pain that is involved in these movies. I would much rather watch Avengers than, for instance, when John and I started dating, he made me watch Shawshank Redemption, and at the end of the movie, spoilers for whoever hasn't seen it, he turns to me because it's his favorite movie, and he says, like, wasn't that great? And they got out, and it was amazing. And all I could think about in turn was like, did you see what happened in that prison? That was awful. Because I was so stuck in the pain that was experienced, I just didn't even have fun with a redemptive ending. So yeah, I think 7s, we have a wide range of how we show up, but those are some of the ways that I see in the everyday life the 7 really show up for me.
Yeah, that's funny.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all the numbers.
All the numbers. So I'm sure people who are watching this or will be watching this, like I've said before, I know you're thinking about it. Definitely, we're going to give some resources at the end of this to help you take those steps to learn about what your number might be. And thankfully, we'll also help you learn about other people's numbers. But before we totally get there, we wanted to, is this the question that we're on?
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to ask, so how does one benefit from knowing their number in relation to their personal walk with the Lord? Like how, because a lot of times people talk about the Enneagram and Christianity, but how do you combine those?
Yeah, I think for me, when I first started learning about the Enneagram, I did it in the context of the Christian faith. And honestly, one reason why I feel like that is so important, because if you look at the Enneagram for what it is, it can be really like a bummer, to where you're like, oh man, like it just feels really heavy because you do like see some of your things that you don't like about your year. And so like for me, but that's where I think the beauty of Jesus and the gospel comes in, to where he makes all things right. And so, he has uniquely made you and crafted you. And the Enneagram is a great tool, I think, to help you better understand yourself. And like where, I often feel like I don't measure up or things aren't right, and there's good in that. And that isn't right. Like it isn't how it's supposed to be. But through Jesus, he makes things right. Only through him can my talked about our core fear and our core desires. Well, those can only be met through Jesus. Like they can't be met through anyone else. And so it actually with God, I think even deeper and like, okay, at the core of my being, this is what I long for, and this is meets that. And so that's why I feel like learning the Enneagram in this context is so helpful, because it really does lead to just health and growth and joy in your walk with God.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm thinking as you're sharing that for me, that probably looks like that I need to really work on truly believing that when God says, like, I've come to give life and life abundant, that he means it. And that I don't have to provide myself or try and safeguard that for myself. And I think each number could probably think of some verses that maybe they might want to sort of internalize more than.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also curious what your thoughts would be on like what are some maybe not good practices using Enneagram?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of not good practices out there with the Enneagram, because it has become much more popular. And in some ways that's good, but it really does require some learning and investigating. And so I would say do your very best, because it's super tempting, because I finally made my husband like take an assessment and have him read the book, and to where I was like, well, I think you're this number. It's like, don't type another person. If you can avoid it. Partly it's because you cannot assess someone's internal world and what their motivation is behind it. Like the behavior can look a certain way. Like, for example, you could clean your apartment because it needs to be clean, but a 1 might do it because that's the right thing to do. Like an apartment should be clean. That's my motivation for doing it, because that's why. A 2 might do it because I want to create a healthy or a comfortable environment who are coming over. They're doing it for other people, not because it's right.
Right.
And you can go through a whole list of the numbers for all 9 numbers. The behavior is going to look exactly the same, but your motivation is going to be vastly different for all of them. And so there's no way you can really assess that. That's someone has to do that work themselves. And the last thing I would say, bad practices, is never use it as a weapon, or to be like, oh, that's the thing to do, or that's such a the reality of it is we're all in process, we're all in growth, and all of us have our unhealthy and healthy ways of seeing and viewing the world. And to not shame people because they're a certain number. No one's better than the other. So
yeah,
that's so true.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so you had mentioned earlier a couple different things. For instance, you mentioned a book that your husband had read, and a podcast that you were even listening to earlier today. Yeah. And so I was just wondering, what are some of your favorite resources that you would point people to?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the top 2 books I would say that are kind of the Enneagram go-to first books would be The Road Back to You by Suzanne Stabile and Ian Morgan Cron. That's going to help you, like that'll be a much more in-depth overview and explanation of the Enneagram than what you got here. And so that's really helpful as you identify your types. And another book by Bill would be The Path Between Us. And so this is, the subtitle is An Enneagram Journey to Healthy Relationships. And so this deals more with how the numbers relate with one another. And so I think, and then two more things I would say, where I have taken some online courses, some free, some not free, but yourenneagramcoach.com by her name is Beth McCord. And pretty much everything I read today was from her class that I took. And it's very gospel centered, and she does a great job. Her husband's a pastor, and so they have really brought good theology to the Enneagram, and she has at least 15 to 20 years experience on it. And so her materials are excellent. They have a free assessment, so that I would suggest taking the assessment. It's free, with the idea of knowing that assessments are probably 75 to 80% accurate. I hear you in the right direction, but just don't get the results and say, that's it, that's my number. I would take that and take some reading of books to kind of figure that out. And then the last thing I would say, the thing that actually started me on this journey, was a podcast called That Sounds Fun by Annie F. Downs, if you've listened to that podcast ever. But last summer, she had something called the Enneagram Summer Series, and where she interviewed a male and a female of each of the 9 types, and just what it was like to be them. And she had Beth McCord come and give an explanation at the beginning of the podcast. And then, but for me, it's just hearing someone was that number really helped me identify. And the second I heard the 1 years, and I was like, okay, I think that's my number. But I still investigating and realized, okay, no, I think that's it. But that was really helpful for me. And then there's so many things out there. Suzanne Stabile is the guru. So anything by her, she has a podcast as well. So yeah.
No, that's excellent.
That was a lot of information.
It's really good.
So good. John and I read The Road Back to You. That was kind of our first introductory book into this. It felt not fair, because this whole time I'm like, what number am I? What number am I? And it wasn't until the very last when they talk about that they got to 7, and I thought I was about 3 or 4 other numbers before I got there.
Yeah, you thought you were a 3.
I thought it was a 3, a 9. Like, who knows? And then John just immediately is like, definitely a 1. I got it. 100% me.
Yep. And I think I had a similar emotional reaction to you, Angie, in the sense of like, oh my goodness, this is the worst. But then I read more, but also researched more.
Because, yeah. But for me, it was comforting to know, oh, other people have this going on the side of their head too. Like it was really helpful to know that I wasn't the only one, and to hear someone else describe it that wasn't me was really, impactful.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think one of the things I love about listening to other people explain their experiences on podcasts, but also reading accounts, is if you haven't already experienced some of the things that they've gone through or felt or realized, especially for those of us who might not be as introspective as others, it gives you an idea of what to look out for. Because a lot of times, until you are kind of looking for certain things in yourself, you just are oblivious of it. Maybe other people could tell you, oh yes, definitely I see this in you. But a lot of times it's not until someone points it out. And so when people talk about, for me, 7s, a certain trait, is so helpful for me to know, I should keep an eye out for this and see if I experience this, or if I'm, especially if it's something that I don't want to be true, that's not a healthy practice, I can have that on my radar, as opposed to just going through life oblivious. And it's been really helpful.
Yeah. And we didn't really talk about this, but I mean, one thing about the Enneagram, if you're just seeing like the 9-point star, essentially with all the numbers, is that you have your wings. So the number on either side of you, that influences you. And like, if you tend to lean towards one way or the other, you have a point where you go somewhere in stress and somewhere in health. And so if you look at this, you yourself are relating with so many of the numbers already. So it's not like I'm a 1 and that's it. But like I go to 7s in health, and in stress I go to 4s, and then I have my 2 wing and my 9 wing, and which if I apologize if this is the first time you've heard of the Enneagram, because it sounds like mumbo jumbo. So I fully recognize, because the first time I would hear that, I'm like, oh my goodness, like that's ridiculous. But the more that you learn, you understand, and so you yourself are relating to a lot of the numbers on the diagram anyways, and so it helps to learn about all of them. So
that's right. So true.
Yeah.
And plus, again, if you've got other people in your life, which every one of us does, then it is so helpful to be able to navigate, especially when they've typed themselves, okay, how can I better care for you? Like your friend who's a 2. And I think also care for yourself. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think hopefully even talking about wings and stress and things like that encourages people who are watching this, go buy a book or go listen to these podcasts. It will help so much getting you further down that road. And this tonight is really just to help people,
just an introduction, like
get
a 101.
an idea of what it is and start to think, hopefully, maybe this would be helpful. Because I would say if you actually engage with it, it will be.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
There's no if.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, especially right now, are talking mental wellness and mental health and all that kind of stuff. And I think that, if you're unfamiliar with the Enneagram and you're curious, it could do a lot, like we've already said, to help you understand yourself and understand why you are reacting the way that you're reacting in, our paused country. So yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah. Angie, do you
well,
have
and
any
especially how you relate to stress? What?
I was just going to ask any last thoughts, so go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think, living in this COVID world that we're living in right now, everyone's experiencing some stress, probably on a daily level, whether it's low grade or not. And so for me, it's been helpful to have a reminder of, okay, this is how I respond to, like, how I respond in stress even. And so, like, I've also heard the Enneagram be described as like rumble strips on a road. So it's like, if I know how I respond in stress and I'm going down a road and then it's like, whoa, like I'm experiencing some behavior, it's like, oh, I'm off course. Like I'm hearing these rumble strips, like, because I just got off the road here. And so the Enneagram has been helpful for me to identify times when I've been really stressed, which I wouldn't have really said I was, but based on my behavior, I'm like, oh, like I'm going off the path here. This is my stress behavior. That's been helpful to remember or have pointed out to me. If other people know you well, they can tell you, hey, wait a second, you're stressed. So
that is so true. I mean, I do the same thing, honestly. We all should have warning signs that we use to help give us indicators of how we're doing, because intellectually it might not dawn on us until we're much further down that road, how stressed we really are, and how unhealthy we might be. And so, like, that's so great. Is there any last thoughts before we say goodbye, do you think?
Oh, I mean, if you have extra time on your hands and you want to take a dive into it, I think it's great. Yeah. So
we wholeheartedly encourage it too.
Yeah.
Angie suggested some really great material. And if you have other questions, you can reach out to John and I, or just message our Instagram page, which is crew_Manhattan on Instagram. And so we'd be happy to kind of point you in some more directions if you want that. There's lots of resources out there. But thank you so much for joining us. Angie, thank you so much. We appreciate you walking us through it, and you have great examples. And so we're so thrilled that you could join us today.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I don't get to do this often, so it's
good.
It was fun.
You mean you don't get to live stream on YouTube very often?
No. Or, I'm married to a 5 who, engages in the Enneagram because of me, but if I get to talk about it with people,
There you
I'm
go.
very happy.
Awesome.
So this was
Who
fun.
knows? Maybe one day, if we get enough excitement about it, we'll have a round two. We'll see. We'll talk about wings.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Angie. And thank you again, everybody, for coming out and who's going to listen to this retroactively. So we'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.